All right, everybody, welcome back to the #1 television program in the history of the universe. I am Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon, The Blackest Heart, and The Lonesome Crown. All three books published by Simon & Schuster's Saga Press. Today I'm going to be reviewing book number 4 in A Song of Ice and Fire, and that is A Feast for Crows by George R.R. Martin. Came out in 2005, and I've got the first edition version right here in hardcover. So let's talk about the covers first, because you know I love graphic design and cover illustration, and so we always review those. So this is the original hardcover version cover. It's all right. I mean, it's, you know, it gets the job done. It's nothing spectacular that's going to blow you away. But, you know, it's got a good graphic, an elegant graphic to it. It's colorful. I like the gold foil, embossed font here that they used, and then the little icon there. And then we've got a similar icon of a crow here on... And now this is the HBO. There's a lot of different versions of this book out here with different covers. These just happen to be the two I've got. This is the HBO version of the paperback. I like this one quite a bit. I think this one's a little more snazzy. I think if this one was in hardcover, it would look super dope. But you know, it is what it is. There's so many different versions of this out there that, you know, everyone's version is going to be different. So let's talk about A Feast for Crows. Now, I read, if you followed my channel and you know about my George R.R. Martin book collection and my history with George R.R. Martin and his books, I was given an arc, actually. My good friend Dave Farland, who was a writer back in the, he's since passed, but Dave Farland, he was given an arc by his publisher of several fantasy novels that were coming out in about 1995, 96. And he had an arc of A Game of Thrones, and he gave it to me to read before he read it. And he's like, hey, tell me what you think about this. So I read this, and I was like, damn, that was dynamite, dude. And so then I waited until a book came out, and then I bought it right off the shelf the first day it came out in the Barnes & Noble back in when it came out. So I was one of the OG Martin fans, you know what I mean? It's like I was a fan of Game of Thrones before it had even hit the shelves. And since then I met Martin only once. He did sign. So this is an original. So these are my first edition original. I've been reading these as they've come out. I've been just one of my favorite fantasy series of all time since the beginning. Anyway, let's talk about Feast for Crows. Well, I waited, these came out pretty regularly, about every year and a half, the first 3 books. And then we waited about 5 or 6 years for the 4th book. And it seemed like such an excruciating wait. Of course, then it came out, and then we waited another 5 or 6 years for Dance with Dragons to come out. And it was such an excruciating wait. And now we're still waiting, but for the other books. But, you know, that's another story for another time. What did I think of this one when it first came out? You know, this is my 3rd time reading it. I read it when it first came out, and then I reread it in preparation for this book's release. And so I haven't touched these. I haven't touched this book since probably 2010 or 2011. So it's been about 11 years since I've cracked this book open. Whereas the first 3 books in the series I've read about 10 times each. So I remember when I first read this, I was a wee bit disappointed. I still loved it, but I was a wee bit disappointed because half the characters weren't in it, and George R.R. Martin had forewarned us this book, along with Dance with Dragons, were going to take place at the same time, and we were just going to get half the character story in this book, the other half of the character story in this book. So I was a wee bit disappointed the first time I read this. I'm like, okay, well, I didn't get to know anything about Tyrion, or I didn't get to see Jon Snow, or I didn't get to see, you know, the Khaleesi. I didn't get to see Daenerys Targaryen or any of that stuff. When we were just more concentrated on Cersei Lannister, Arya Stark, Sansa Stark, Brienne of Tarth, Jaime Lannister, a lot of the stuff that happened down in Dorne with the sand snakes and all this, that, and the other, which is super badass stuff. Don't get me wrong. The second time I read it was in preparation for this book, and I thought it was cool. My favorite reread has been this most recent reread, and it started from the opening pages. The opening pages, I remembered how awesome of a writer George R.R. Martin is just from the opening pages, just the prologue, where he introduces a bunch of new people. And it's just about some thieves and an alchemist, and they're shooting arrows into apples, and they're talking about the rumors of these dragons and stuff like that. And it's just an absolutely wonderfully written scene. And just within those 20 or some odd pages, I remembered how well George R.R. Martin just sets up a scene with his writing. Like, you know everything about the landscape that this scene is taking place in. You know everything about the handful of characters that are interacting in this scene. And their interaction is absolutely riveting and interesting. And I love the fact that they're shooting these apples with arrows as they're speaking and talking, and it gives them some action to do and something for us to visualize. And and the subject they're talking about is interesting because we know, as the reader, we know kind of what's going on, even though they're sort of in the dark and it's sort of a mystery to them. But we get to see this play out, and I was just like, oh my God. I think about my own writing, and I'm like, one of the writers, like my own books, one of the writers that I studied, the way he put together prose, the way he describes characters, how many words he uses to describe characters, how many words he uses when he does flashbacks or exposition scenes. I really studied the way George R.R. Martin wrote that first Game of Thrones book, which was titled Game of Thrones, by the way. I really studied that, and I tried to implement all those tricks and techniques and writing styles and stuff into my own work. And then I'd kind of like forgotten all about that. And then when I was rereading this, it really struck me again just how he's just one of the best. He's probably in the top 2 best fantasy writers I can think of, him and Tad Williams. And those guys are actually in the top 5 of my favorite writers of all time, regardless of genre. And so I'm just like, once again, just amazed. And so let's get into some more specifics about the book. Like I said, it is sort of half a story. It's not a full story because the other half of the story is taking place in this other book at the same time. But this half of the story is great. And I think my favorite chapters to follow were Brienne of Tarth. I liked her journey in this book quite a bit. Even during my first read, even before the Game of Thrones television show came out. Now, the Game of Thrones television show, if we want to compare and contrast, I think the television show even made Brienne of Tarth's journey even way more, because it was fucking interesting, and here it was even way more interesting. Is one of the things where I think the show excelled, and maybe even trumped the actual book, which is hard because mostly the books trumped the show by a long shot. But I think one of my favorite storylines in this book, I think the show actually made even better. Brienne of Tarth's journey as she was trying to search for Sansa Stark. And I liked Sansa Stark's storyline too, as she is, goes through what she goes through. And I don't want to mention too many specifics because it's spoilery. However, that being said, I don't think it's spoilering anything for anybody watching this video, because I imagine if you're watching this video, you know the story, whether you've read the books already or you've watched the show. But so for the one out of a gazillion people, because I get a gazillion views for every video I do. So for the one person out of a gazillion that doesn't even know what Game of Thrones is, I'm not going to spoil anything. And then I liked Jaime. It was Cersei Lannister and Sansa. My favorite character, and I know I've said this before and I take shit for it. My favorite character in the whole Game of Thrones saga is Sansa Stark. She was from the beginning all the way to the end, both books and TV show. And everybody is like, wow, you like that one the best. I'm just like, I just do. I think it's well written. I like the arc that George R.R. Martin is giving her, and the TV show kind of finished that arc off in a way that I enjoyed. And Arya Stark stuff, my second favorite character, Arya. I like the Stark sisters more than anybody else in these books. And her journey as she travels across the sea and gets involved with the whole many-eyed god adventure, or many-faced god. Well, I'm sure many faces would mean many eyes. The many-faced god, and all that is just all in this. And I had just quite simply forgot how brilliant of a book this actually was. Because this is only my third time reading it, whereas these three just seem to be on another level of brilliance for my whole life, because I've read them like 10 times each. So Feast for Crows, I guess there's really not much more to say about it other than it continues on. This fucking epic journey that we've been reading about and anticipating, and we've been collecting and following for so many years, and that we can't wait to read the next George R.R. Martin book, and see where that goes, and I can't wait to see. But we'll be getting to this book soon. I'll be rereading this one soon, probably within the next year, and we'll get all of these out. And then I've got a whole bunch other. I've got all the other George R.R. Martins. I've got his collections of short stories I'm gonna read through. I've got like Fever Dream, Armageddon Rag. I've got all of those I'm gonna read through. We've got Fire and Ice, or whatever the spin-off thing was that he did. We're gonna be doing that. But anyway, 10 out of 10. I mean, 10 out of 10. That's what this book deserves. 10 stars out of 10 stars. Feast for Crows.